This conversation is going to have a biographical arc to it, so I'm not going to do much of a bio right now, only to say that, that Dr. Perry has his PhD in mathematics, and that we all know his career as Undersecretary of Defense, as Secretary of Defense, but it's not as well known that he was one of the people that created the digital age. That there was a period of time when there was a discontinuity in conventional forces with the then Soviet Union, and the then Secretary of Defense, it was Harold Brown? Yeah, Harold Brown tapped Dr. Perry to modernize our conventional forces to counteract the numerical superiority of the then Soviet Union. So what Dr. Perry did was he used his intelligence. And he took us from basically an analog system to the digital age that we live in. So the digital age we live in is largely responsible for what Dr. Perry did when he was in the private sector. That's not very well known, and we're not going to go into that in depth because we're going to go into the ways in which he's made sure that we even have a world to go digital. So he's devoted his life to ensure that his 8 grandchildren will be able to continue having grandchildren, and his 5 children will continue to have more grandchildren, hopefully. But the reason why he, at 89 years old, flew out here yesterday to share with us, the reason why he cares and is devoting his time to public service is going to be pretty apparent in this very short video that he put together. So, run the show.
Buried deep under these bone-dry high plains, in a covert section of a massively hardened centrifuge facility, a team is hard at work. They are members of a breakaway faction of the country's security forces, and they are busy enriching 40 kilograms of uranium. By July 3rd, they achieve their target of 90% enrichment, and then transfer the uranium to a nearby secret lab, where another team of technicians assembles it into a crude nuclear bomb. On August 31, they finish their work. They put the bomb in a packing crate labeled agricultural equipment and transport it to a nearby airfield where it is stored in a warehouse. 2 weeks later, it is removed and loaded onto an aircraft with civilian air cargo markings. It flies to Dubai, where the crate is transferred, along with other goods and equipment, to a global air transport freighter. Destination, Washington, D.C. The plane lands at Washington's Dulles International Airport at 2:47 a.m. on September the 15th. By late afternoon, the crate is delivered to a warehouse in the southeast part of the district. Then, before daybreak, on September the 17th, the bomb is removed from the crate and loaded onto a delivery truck. Several hours later, an American citizen eases the truck out into traffic. She drives it to a location on Pennsylvania Avenue, midway between the White House and the Capitol building. At 11:09 a.m., she stops in the middle of traffic, climbs down onto the street, and triggers the detonator. The bomb explodes with a power of 15 kilotons. There are more than 80,000 instant deaths, including the president, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, and the 320 members of Congress present when the bomb goes off. There are also more than 100,000 seriously wounded, and virtually no place to treat them. Telecommunication facilities throughout the greater Washington area have gone down. Soon, cable news is broadcasting scenes of vast devastation from the capital. A short time later, all major news outlets report receiving an identical message. The message claims that 5 more bombs are hidden in 5 different cities across the country. It says one of these bombs will be set off each week for the next 5 weeks, unless all American troops based overseas are ordered to return immediately to the U.S. homeland. The nation is hurled into panic. Everything begins shutting down. Within a half hour, the stock market drops more than 70% before trading is halted. From coast to coast, masses of people begin to stream out of cities, no matter their size or location. There is widespread gridlock. Cell phone systems are soon overwhelmed, and calls cannot go through. Internet access is impossible in many regions, and the nation is now in a constitutional crisis. By succession, the Senate President pro tem is now the country's president. But he is being treated for pancreatic cancer far from the capital at the Mayo Clinic. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of whom were testifying to the House Armed Services Committee on their recent budget request, are dead as well. Martial law is declared in Washington and surrounding regions, and the next day, the entire country. There is widespread looting and violence in many cities. Federal and National Guard troops are mustered. Soon there are reports of troops firing on crowds. There are increasing numbers of reports of rioting against immigrants and foreigners. Within days, the military begins to construct large detention centers around the country.
This is a description of one relatively small bomb in one city. Presently, I believe there's over 16,000 nuclear bombs, and this is a description of a bomb about the size of Hiroshima. Earlier today, you were describing a bomb that the Soviet Union experimented with, and I wondered if you could describe the size of that bomb in relation to this bomb.
Well, this bomb was like the Hiroshima bomb, about 15,000 tons, 15 kilotons. We have detonated bombs much larger than that. Our largest bomb was called Castle Bravo, 15 megatons, 1,000 times more powerful than this bomb. The Soviets have detonated a bomb which they called the Tsar bomb, the Tsar Bomba, which is 57 megatons. That bomb actually was designed to be 100 megatons, but they scaled it down for the test. Otherwise, the pilot who was dropping the bomb might not have been able to get it far enough away from the blast when it went off. And indeed, that's what happened. The bomb was dropped high altitude from a plane, had a parachute, and then detonated just before it hit the ground. Even at the distance the pilot was from that, the plane was badly damaged. And the pilot never flew again, and the plane was a wreck. That was the largest bomb ever detonated so far. Most people simply don't understand or can't grasp the extent of the catastrophe that would happen if we don't bring these nuclear weapons under control, and in fact, ultimately work to eliminate them before they eliminate us. So I wrote the book because I believe that the nuclear dangers we face today, of which that video showed you one of them. The nuclear dangers we face today are greater than they were during the Cold War. The likelihood of a nuclear catastrophe today is greater than it was during the Cold War. But our policies are in no way commensurate with those dangers. And I believe our policies are inadequate because people are just blissfully unaware of what the dangers are. They think the nuclear danger passed with the ending of the Cold War. We still have more than 15,000 nuclear bombs, and today the United States and Russia are resuming the kind of hostility that they had during the Cold War. So you've seen one way that we might have a nuclear catastrophe, a nuclear terrorist attack. Another way would be a regional nuclear war, a war between India and Pakistan, for example. That's a small nuclear war. They only have 100 bombs each. So maybe in that nuclear war, 50 or 100 bombs would be detonated, aside from the tens of millions of Indians and Pakistanis that would be killed. There would be a consequence that affected the whole planet. It's called nuclear winter. The soot and the ash that are thrown up into the air from those 100 bombs detonated would create a climate change that would last for many years, which would effectively destroy agriculture on the planet for that period of time. So there's no place to hide. The fact that it's happening in India and Pakistan, we can't turn our back on that, even if we didn't care about the millions of people being killed there, because it's going to affect everybody. Those two nuclear dangers are new. They did not exist during the Cold War. Beyond that, the dangers of the Cold War, which is a war by accident or a war by miscalculation, have come back. And if anything, they're as dangerous now as they were during the Cold War.
The book that Dr. Perry referred to is called My Journey on the Nuclear Brink. And it's kind of a political biography of the nuclear age. And it begins, one of the reasons why Dr. Perry is viscerally connected to the issue goes back to an experience that you share in the book. And I wondered if you could share that experience when you went to Japan.
No, I was just 18. The war was just over. When I was 14 and the war started, more than anything, I wanted to be in the U.S. Army Air Corps. And I was fearful that the war would finish before I turned 18 and could join it, and that's exactly what happened. The war was over in September 1945. I turned 18 in October of 1945, joined the Army anyway, and became part of the Army of Occupation of Japan. So here was my enthusiasm to be part of this war, part of this military, and I got to Tokyo. Nothing had prepared me. Nothing I read prepared me for the scenes of devastation that I saw in Tokyo. These were not done by atomic bombs, but by thousands and thousands of raids of firebombing on Japan. The city was in ruins. I was there a month or two and then was sent down to Okinawa to help in the reconstruction programs at Okinawa. I was in the Army Engineers. When my LST landed at the capital city, Naha, I looked out and could see the city of Naha. Not a building was left standing. Okinawa was the scene of the last great battle of World War II. Of the 100,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island, about 10,000 survived. It was about a 90% casualty rate, either killed in battle or many of them committed suicide before they would be allowed to be surrendered. And we had that to look forward to, multiplied by many times when we did the same and did the invasion of Tokyo, an invasion of Japan mainland. So I saw firsthand this devastation that had been wrought. And then I reflected back to Hiroshima. What I'd seen had been caused by thousands of airplanes, tens of thousands of bombs over many years. The same damage had been done in Hiroshima. One bomb, one airplane, one instant. And even at the age 18, that made an impression on me. This is different. Everything is different. Einstein prophetically at the time said that with the advent of the nuclear bomb, everything has changed. Everything has changed, except the way we think. And at 18, my thinking, all of us, began to change on the basis of what I was seeing. And what happened to me in the rest of the life caused it to change even more. And the book is an experience, is a history of my experiences with nuclear weapons that have shaped my thinking. And I share that thinking with the rest of you so that you can also begin to vicariously understand just how dangerous is the world that we live in and why we should change our actions, change our policies to reduce those dangers.
When you read the book, it almost as if you were fated to be this messenger, a prophetic voice of warning, and a voice of wisdom of how we can get out of this dilemma, which we'll get to later. Because your career really has the seminal events in modernity in this. And I wanted to write it, you come back from Japan, and what was the first job that you had after the war in public service and in defense, in the defense area?
I was working for a firm which had a defense contract. One of their jobs was to design defensive systems against a nuclear attack. And then, since I was a mathematician, they gave me the job of calculating what benefits would be achieved from defending. And so I used what was the then newly developed so-called Monte Carlo techniques for determining how many casualties there would be if we did not defend and how many casualties there would not be. And I did those calculations, and sure enough, it proved the point. We could save 30 million, 40 million lives if you had a defensive system. That was the first half of the equation. The second half, how many were still lost? And there was still 50 million killed. This was with the old arsenals we had back in those days, the little firecracker size nuclear bombs we had then, and the relatively few we had then. And it dawned on me, again, even now at age 21, it dawned on me that there was no way of defending against a mass nuclear attack. It was not an acceptable defense to say only 100 million people would have been killed. It was not an acceptable defense. That the only thing we could do was find a way of preventing that attack from taking place, to stop the nuclear war before it started, and ultimately to get rid of the nuclear bombs. That was my next experience.
Stop a nuclear war from happening. And I remember when this was going on, I guess what I was taught with my friend Richard Cohn here when we were in high school together was duck and cover, Bill.
Yeah.
Which was
fat chance.
Right, that we would duck under the desks and cover. And we kind of believed that this was a real possibility. And I have debated some of these missile defense proponents, and they seem to me to be as distorted in their perception of reality as duck and cover, where they talk about we could have a missile shield that's 90% effective. So if there's 1,000 warheads coming at us, we'd only have 100 of them hit us, and which would, I think, destroy every major city in North America. And so that would be 90% effective. And no one has come up with any missile defense system that could withstand real testing with real spoofs, with multiple balloons that would look like missiles, or any form of deception. So the closest that I remember as a kid of Armageddon was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And by the way, what brought me to this issue was I was interning in Washington as a young man and had lunch with then Senator Robert Kennedy. There were about 5 or 6 of us. And he told us about how close we came in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I will never forget his closing remark in the luncheon, which was, this issue is the litmus test of modernity. If we solve every other issue and don't solve this issue, it won't matter. And that stuck with me. That stuck with me. And I didn't have an opportunity to do anything about it until I became a lawyer in the 1980s with a lawyers group that we brought lawyers from the then Soviet Union to the United States and brought them to jury trials and brought them to bankruptcy court. And the thing that really amazed them was when they saw a judge in Philadelphia holding the city of Philadelphia in contempt of court for overcrowding in prisons. And then lawyers from the United States went over there and came back and said, lo and behold, there's human beings there. They're not some other creature, and we can talk with them. But I didn't have the hands-on experience that you had with coming right to the brink, and you were right there with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we had Secretary McNamara do a session with us, and I'll tell you some of the stuff that he said, but I'd like to hear what you experienced during that time.
Well, McNamara, of course, actually sat in the inner council with the president and making the decisions. I was 34 at the time. I had a something minor role. I was called back to Washington to assist in the intelligence assessment of what was happening. I got a phone call from my friend who was the deputy director of intelligence at the time, asked me to come back to Washington. I said, sure, I'll rearrange my schedule and come back on Monday. He said, no, you don't understand. I want you to come right away. So I got on the night flight and flew to Washington. The next morning, I walked into his office, and I was stunned when he showed me the pictures that were taken by the U-2 of the missile deployment underway in Cuba. That was the first I had heard of it. It was not yet public. And he put me on a team of about 7 or 8 people, half of us scientists and half of them photo interpreters. And we spent the next 8 or 9 days and nights studying every day. All the information was coming in from Cuba. And then by midnight or so, we had a report written for President Kennedy, which is the first thing he read the next day, guiding him on what he would do that day, on what was actually happening. How soon were the missiles going to be operational? Were the nuclear warheads made it yet? All those questions. Every day I went into that analysis center, I thought would be my last day on Earth. That was my judgment at the time of how dangerous the situation was. And everything I've learned since then has told me there was even more dangerous than I thought. I did not know then that besides the strategic missiles, which the Soviets had in Cuba, there were also tactical missiles that already had the nuclear warheads on them, with the authority of the people on the field to launch those without authorization. I did not know that there were Soviet submarines that were tracking the ships delivering missiles to Cuba. The submarines had nuclear torpedoes, and the captains of the submarine had authorization to use those nuclear torpedoes. And in one instance, which we learned about only after the fact, one of our destroyers dropped a depth charge on that submarine. And the skipper of the submarine, the Russian skipper, was prepared to fire the torpedo to sink the destroyer. That would have been the beginning of a nuclear war. Happily, and just by good luck, his 2 subordinates talked him out of doing it. All this we learned only after the fact. So what I thought was a very dangerous situation at the time was far more dangerous. We survived the Cuban Missile Crisis more by good luck than by good management.
If you really want to get a sense of the feel of it, President Kennedy taped the sessions in the Oval Office at that time. And there's one session that he had with General Curtis LeMay, in which Curtis LeMay was instrumental in the bombing of Japan as well.
He was the one that dropped those bombs on Tokyo, you bet.
He was the guy. And General LeMay was also instrumental in building our nuclear arsenal at one point. It was very important in that. And so there's one of them where he's saying to Kennedy, you have to invade, because if you don't, it's appeasement. And this appeasement will lead to the Soviet takeover of Berlin. And you'll be responsible, and you have to invade now, or there will be World War III, and you have to do it now. And he's pressuring Kennedy. And then Kennedy leaves, and there's a discussion with LeMay and some of the other generals. And you can hear them essentially bad-mouthing the president and pushing for an invasion of Cuba. Now, had we not had the Bay of Pigs, and Kennedy had not developed a sense of reticence in trusting the Joint Chiefs, who had told him with the Bay of Pigs everything would be fine, had the Joint Chiefs, who were obviously patriotic and operating in good faith, had their way, and had Curtis LeMay's vision of invading Cuba taken place, we now know that civilization, as we know, would have ended. Because the field commanders there had authority to launch. So Secretary McNamara, at a session that we did at the United Nations, recounted a conversation he had with Fidel Castro about that, and told us that Fidel Castro had told him that the field commanders had authority, and McNamara said, you know that if they had launched, that Cuba would have been annihilated within the afternoon, and there wouldn't have been any Cuba left. And Castro said, yes, we understood that, but that was the logic of the time. That was the logic of the situation. And then Castro challenged McNamara and said, is it any different now? And that's where he left it. Yeah. And to some extent, it's really not all that different, really. I mean, once they go off, they all start going, right?
As I said, the difference is that the danger today is greater than it was then. We had, I won't repeat myself on that. That makes the point.
Well, I just saw a movie producer came in, my friend Mark Romeo, who did a movie about a Soviet colonel who was on watch in September of 1983, Stanislav Petrov, and the computers all went off saying that there was a full-scale American launch. And Colonel Petrov did not pass on the information up the command and control. Had he passed it up the command and control, he believed there wouldn't have been time for deliberation or actual deliberation, and the Soviets would have launched 11,000 nuclear warheads rather than lose them in a first volley from the United States. So he violated his protocols. And I had the privilege of interviewing him when he came to the UN to get an award. But what he was really interested in was coming to see Kevin Costner. Because to him, Kevin Costner is a real hero. It's a great movie. It's called The Man Who Saved the World, and it'll be coming out this year. And so I asked him, how did you have so much courage to save the world? And he said, well, first I was a computer engineer, and I knew computers make mistakes. And also, God told me he didn't want the world to end. And then he said, and my superiors had a big problem. Reward me for saving the world or punish me for violating my protocols. But what concerned them and got them most angry was I believed in God. So, I mean, this was just an individual that we're all beholden to. And sitting next to me is an individual for whom these kind of mistakes are not just movies or abstractions or things we read about, but you actually experienced one of these.
When I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering in 1979, I was awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning by a phone call. I picked up the phone, and on the other end, the general identified himself as the Watch Officer of North American Air Defense Command. He said, my computers are showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. And for one heart-stopping moment, I thought that the catastrophe we had avoided in the Cuban Missile Crisis we were now about to experience. But he quickly explained after that he had concluded it was a false alarm. So why was he calling me? I was Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. I wasn't in the chain of command at the time. He was calling me because he knew that he was going to have to brief the president the next morning on this. And he wanted to be able to explain to him what had gone wrong with his computers and also what he was going to do to make sure that wouldn't go wrong again. Well, the short version of the answer to that is it took us 3 days to find out what was wrong. What was wrong was that when the sergeant came on duty that night, instead of putting the operating tape into the computer, he put a training tape. And so the computer was showing a very realistic attack scenario. Human error. We had this wonderful system, all sorts of safeguards on human error. It took us 3 days to find that out, what had happened. So the lesson from that is that no matter how good your systems are, no matter how carefully you work to prevent this, the humans are in the system, and sooner or later somebody's going to make a mistake. That was, had he acted on that, had he not recognized it was a false alarm, and the president got a call at 3 o'clock in the morning with about 7 or 8 minutes to decide whether or not to launch our missiles before they were wiped out. This is called launch them or lose them. Then we would have started a nuclear war by accident. Now, after the Cold War ended, I thought that problem had gone away, because it's not just the mechanical systems that count, it's the context. What is the context when you get this false alarm signal, when you get the signal? The general who was on watch that night was wise enough to realize nothing was going on in the world at that time. There was no reason to expect an attack. And so he started looking for what was wrong and found he didn't know exactly what was wrong, but he concluded it had to be wrong. But suppose that same accident, that same incident had occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or during the Suez Crisis we had a little bit earlier where we were on DEFCON 3. We very likely would have actually ended up with a launch, because the president getting that phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning, wakes up, has 2 or 3 minutes to decide. He has no context. He doesn't know what's going on. It's just a ridiculous system. Today, we still have the same policy. It's called launch on warning, launch on warning. Today, we still have the same fail-proof systems that keep us from getting a false alarm. In other words, systems that can go wrong every couple of years. And today, contrary to my expectations in the Cold War ended, we still have a context in which we have an ugly relationship between the United States and Russia. We have insults and threats being bandied back and forth, and we're in the process of building a whole new generation of nuclear missiles. So context matters, and context threatens us all.
Boris Yeltsin talked about that context in 1995, the weather satellite incident. I'm sure you're familiar. I think you were on watch then, right?
Yeah, I was.
Yeah. So apparently the Norwegians launched a weather satellite off the coast of Norway, and they anticipated that that could be mistaken for a Trident launch. So they notified the Russians that they were going to do this. But apparently it wasn't passed up the command and control. So the first volley of a nuclear exchange would be an explosion over Moscow, creating an electromagnetic pulse that would fry the electrical systems and computers and refrigerators too, and cars and all kinds of televisions. Basically shut down the society. And the time between Norway and Moscow for this missile, I think, was 8 minutes. So Yeltsin was notified promptly because they could see it on the they monitored it, and he had I don't know, some of them say it's less than 8 minutes, but we'll say 8 minutes is the maximum to decide whether this was actually an attack by the United States, whether this was a Trident launch, and the proverbial football was open for the first time in Russia. And Yeltsin, in recounting why he did nothing, tells that he knew Bill Clinton. And he didn't believe that Bill Clinton would start a war. It was that simple. It was a human dimension. It was meeting the man face to face and having that human experience. And if there's anything that is instructive to us lawyers in this book, I think, especially litigators, it is Secretary Perry's success stories in which adversarial situations are overcome by seeing the human considerations of what would be intractable adversaries, and then reaching out and succeeding and doing things which appeared impossible. But before we get to that, I want to just bring us up to date, because even 95 is a little far away. On August 30th, 2007, a U.S. B-52 bomber was mistakenly armed with 6 nuclear warheads and flown for more than 3 hours across several states. On October 19th, the Department of Defense and Air Force released a report that concluded handling standards and procedures had not been followed. 4 commanders were relieved of their commands, numerous personnel were disciplined, and in the wake of this and other incidents, the Secretary of the Air Force, Michael Wynne, and Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Michael Mosley, resigned. This is 2007. Missing in America. Now, I mean, and we are, as you pointed out, downwind from what is only a 300-second margin to make a decision should there appear to be a launch in South Asia. And America's command and control is really good. But I personally don't have a lot of confidence in the security and command and control of Pakistan. And yet, that is, as it were, as if it were right next door to us, because that's the nature of the world today. In 2009, the Vanguard, a British Royal Navy nuclear submarine, and Le Triomphant, a French nuclear vessel, collided in the Atlantic Ocean. Both carried nuclear warheads and were on routine patrol. And the defense officials said that they were unable to see one another. So, I mean, it's just it's so unforgiving and so almost irresponsible. Would you say it's irresponsible that we continue this?
It's heartbreaking.
It's worse.
Because our whole future could go up in smoke. And I hate to be the prophet of doom, but if we do not understand the dangers, we will not take the necessary actions to first of all reduce them, and then by finally eliminate them. We have to understand how dangerous it is.
The high point in our lifetime, and for many of us, I think, was in Reykjavik when we saw that Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev were moving to end the Cold War, and that what appeared to be intractable adversaries could start to talk with each other. And you are evidence of the success of overcoming that. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you brought such a honor, dignity, and inspiration in what happened in Bosnia, where there were such divisions.
At the time I was secretary, we had a positive and a cordial relationship with Russia. Hardly could be called a cooperative relation, though. And the big security crisis of the day was in Bosnia, where literally tens of thousands of Bosnian, typically Muslim Bosnians, were being either killed or sent into concentration camps. So the UN sent a peacekeeping force over there to stop that fighting, stop the killing, and without going into detail, the peacekeeping force was outgunned, outmanned, and unsuccessful. We finally got a NATO force together to go in. And I helped organize the force. We sent 50,000 soldiers, half of them being American soldiers. And my responsibility was putting that division together and taking them to Bosnia. I actually walked with them over the bridge into Bosnia the day we went in. But besides our interest and the British interest and the French interest and the Dutch interest and the Baltic countries' interest, there was a Russian interest. They decided they were going to send a brigade of forces in too. And it was going to be like it is in Syria now. There were going to be 2 different armed forces under 2 different commands, and which is a situation for disaster. So both Yeltsin and Clinton agreed that we'd find a way to have those come under a common command. And then they assigned it to the 2 ministers of defense, myself and Minister Gorbachev, to work out the details. Well, the details were getting this Russian brigade to work as a part of an American division reporting to an American general. And not surprisingly, the Russian Minister of Defense didn't think that was a good idea and didn't want to do it. So it took us 4 meetings over a period of 2 months to carry out our 2 presidents' direction to make this happen. We met in Geneva completely unsuccessfully. He said, yet, to everything we were proposing. As the meeting broke up and we had a press conference to report our failure, my then Assistant Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who now, by the way, is our Secretary of Defense, turned to me and said, this is going to be a disaster. He said, we can't let it happen. So don't go out and report to them what we didn't accomplish. Report to them that we agreed to schedule a follow-on meeting. The best advice I ever got. That's what we did. And finally, the 4th meeting, we made it happen. And we had I have a picture in my book of the 4th meeting where we, having reached the conclusion, we stood in front of a sign that said, NATO plus Russia equals success. And the Russian minister and I were there shaking hands over that. 2 months later, the American troops went in, the Russian brigade went in, reporting to an American general. And 2 months after that, I went over and pinned a medal, an American medal, on the Russian brigade commander. For he had done such a good job and working so well with the American forces that my American division commander, General Nash, reported to me it was one of the best brigades he had. So it was but thinking today, could you imagine Russian and American forces agreeing to work together, reporting to the other commander on a subject of mutual interest? We've deteriorated so far from that. And that was, I think, the high point of U.S.-Russian relations. But it indicated that we could work together, we could cooperate to a common purpose if we only would decide to do it and listen carefully to what the other people's concerns were and find a way of trying to meet them.
What was it that allowed you to be successful and build those bridges coming right out of a period of existential threat to the point where we'd have this level of cooperation that's not being done now? What was it? What was the key to your success in that instance?
I don't know. First of all, I was highly motivated to see a Russian. Having lived through the Cold War, I didn't want to see another Cold War start. I was highly motivated to see the U.S.-Russian détente being completely successful. And secondly, always my philosophy in dealing with other people is listening to them. Listen to them, and listen to what their problems are, and see if you can find a way of resolving those problems, which we were finally, I'm a slow learner, it took me 4 meetings to do that, but we finally figured out how to do it.
Well, you highlight in the book Russia's concern over the expansion of NATO and the way in which you thought we should bring in the Eastern European countries into the fold after the Cold War, and missile defense. And I wondered if you could, explain what those issues are from as the Russians have explained them, and what we might be doing now to build those bridges and to start changing the circumstance.
When I was secretary, I had 2 top priorities. The first priority was to eliminate the scourge of nuclear weapons that we had faced during the Cold War, to deal with the Cold War nuclear legacy. And in 1 term, I succeeded in dismantling 8,000 nuclear weapons, 4,000 in the former Soviet Union and 4,000 in the U.S. And I thought we were off to a good start and we were going to continue to do that. Unfortunately, all that stopped after that. And so we're now facing situations today where there's still 16,000, 17,000 nuclear weapons in the world, enough to destroy the planet several times over. So that was, but my second priority, closely related to the first, was to bring Russia into the Western security circle, make them a part of NATO, make them a part of what we were doing, rather than being outside the circle, throwing in rocks. And for a while, we were successful in doing that. We had this joint operation in Bosnia. We had something called the Partnership for Peace, where Russian and NATO soldiers trained together for peacekeeping exercises. We were really working together seriously, and I thought we were well on the way to having a U.S.-Russia, Western NATO-Russia cooperative effort. I invited the Russian Minister of Defense to attend NATO meetings, and he did. He actually sat in the meetings and participated in them. But things started to turn sour about 19, my last year in office actually, when it was decided to bring 6 more members into NATO from the Eastern European countries. And I was not opposed to that in principle, but I wanted it to be done at the time when Russia was comfortable with NATO and when they had an opportunity to be a NATO member also. So I argued we should delay that. We weren't ready for it yet. And a premature move to expand NATO would push Russia in the wrong direction, being fearful of NATO again, looking to NATO as an enemy. I felt so strongly about that when we started moving ahead with it, I asked the President to hold a special meeting of the National Security Council so I could plead my case. He did, we did, I lost the argument. And so we went ahead with the expansion of NATO, which I think was the first we started to slide down that slippery slope. It was followed over by a number of other moves, all of which had one characteristic. Russia didn't like them. They were protesting. They didn't want us to do that. And we not only said no, we basically said to them, your opinion doesn't matter. You can't do anything about it. We don't care what you think. And we didn't say that in so many words, but that was clearly the meaning conveyed by our actions. And after so many years of this, of Russia feeling disrespected, feeling like they were not part of the Western Circle, somewhere along the line, a switch occurred in the mind, I think in this case in Putin's mind, say, the hell with them. We're going to go our own way. We're going to show them that we do count. So today we have what I think is a very ugly situation with Russia. The cause of it, I think, in the first instance, was actions taken by the United States and NATO. The cause of it for the last 5 or 6 years have been actions taken by Russia. The invasion of Crimea, the interference in Ukraine, the threatening of the Baltics, the rebuilding of the Cold War nuclear arsenal, and the flaunting of the nuclear weapons and the threat to use those nuclear weapons. All of that we look at today and say Russia is a guilty party, and indeed I think they are. But we have to look back 10 years further to say what pushed them down that path. And that was thoughtless actions, I think, taken by the United States and NATO.
There were some very thoughtful actions that were successful. The cooperative Nunn-Lugar process that you were very much part of. And I think it's really important to talk about those successes and how they were achieved and what they mean.
Even before I was Secretary of Defense, after the Soviet Union broke up. When the Soviet Union broke up, the nuclear weapons stayed in the countries, the new republics that they were based in. So you had 3 new nuclear nations at that time: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, now independent nations, and now nuclear powers. And Nunn and Lugar, in their wisdom, decided that was a dangerous situation. In fact, we called it the loose nukes problem.
That's Senator Sam Nunn.
Senator Sam Nunn, Senator Dick Lugar.
Republican and a Democrat.
Neither of whom, a Republican and a Democrat, neither of whom are in the Senate, of course, today. And so they planned a trip to Russia and Ukraine to see just how bad it was. And they invited 2 people out of government to join them on that trip as observers. One of them was myself, and the other was Ash Carter. Again, the same Carter who is now the Secretary of Defense. And as we wrote, after our visit there, we wrote back on the airplane, we agreed the situation was more dangerous than we had thought, and we sort of put together the idea, the concept of the Nunn-Lugar program. In fact, Ash Ash Carter stayed behind and actually helped write the legislation.
The danger was that the materials were inadequately safeguarded, that the
this case
nukes
was not just
themselves...
material, these are bombs.
Actual bombs were not adequately
you
safeguarded.
bet. Bombs as well as material.
So this would be in Kazakhstan, there's over 1,000...
Kazakhstan, there were altogether, well, just in Ukraine alone, there were more nuclear weapons than England, France, and China combined, just in Ukraine. So we set out to get, first of all, the political agreement for those countries to let us dismantle them. And then we sent in the force to do it. And as the non-Lugar and it was done under the non-Lugar program, which was gave the Secretary of Defense in the United States the authority and the resources to go in and get that job done.
But you convinced them that we could go in and take over those nuclear bombs.
Yes, we did. And we dismantled them. We helped them dismantle them. One of the side aspects of that, both in Russia and Ukraine, there was a law, really, that when a military officer was discharged from the services, he had to be given housing. And Ukraine couldn't afford the housing for all these missile officers about to be discharged. So one of the things I did with the non-nuclear program, besides dismantling weapons, I found the resources and to build housing at Pervomaisk, which is a place in Ukraine where they were being dismantled. And we got a Georgian, U.S.-Georgian contractor who built prefabricated houses to give us the designs of the prefabricated houses. We took them over to Ukraine. We found a former defense factory which was not doing anything and converted it to building the prefabricated houses. Then we assembled those prefabricated houses. So these, at Pervomaisk there, where there used to be all the missiles, there's now a housing. My wags on my staff called it Perry Town. And so we built these little houses in Pervomaisk where the missile officers moved after they'd done.
My understanding is that some of these decommissioned missiles actually help provide electricity in the United States. Was that part of what happened?
The uranium, the bombs were driven by highly enriched uranium. That was the explosive force. And so when we dismantled the missiles and the bombs, we took the uranium out, sent it back to the United States, downgraded it, converted it from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium, and then sent it to our nuclear reactors. And half of the electricity generated by nuclear power in the United States today comes from the uranium that come out of that dismantling. So it may well be that the lights in this room right here are coming from uranium that we took out of Kazakhstan and Ukraine.
I mean, if Americans knew these stories, I think it would make a profound difference. You know, that what seems impossible, and it's not that long ago, and you also came very, very close to even resolving North Korea.
That was later. After I left, when I was as Secretary of Defense, the first crisis I had, we almost had a war with North Korea over there wanting to build a nuclear bomb. And we took a very strong stand, and we wouldn't let that happen. Indeed, we almost came to a war over it. And at the last minute, President Carter, former President Carter, was invited to Pyongyang. We had no ambassador to Pyongyang. We had nobody talking with them. And we were on the verge of a war. So Carter went over to Pyongyang and talked with the then great leader, Kim Il-sung. And he got an agreement, he thought, that he was going to do. And he called the White House to let them know. At the time he called, we were all in the White House discussing how many more thousands of soldiers we were going to send over to Korea. We were preparing for a war, basically. And I had, the Secretary of Defense, I'd laid forward to the President 3 alternatives, one of which involved sending another 20,000 troops, another 40,000 troops, and so on. And we're in a war preparation mode. Had all the senior generals who would be responsible for implementing the war there. And while we were in that meeting, deciding how many troops to send over to Korea, a phone call came in from President Carter.
Wow.
And Clinton sent his national security advisor out to take the call, and he came back a little bit and said, Carter says he has an agreement from Kim Il-sung that we will sit down to negotiate his stopping the nuclear processing he was doing. And at the meeting, we decided almost instantaneously to tell him, no, we're not going to accept that unless he agrees that while we're negotiating this change, he stops the nuclear processing he has underway. And Carter said, oh, he won't accept that. And we said, well, tell him that. And the next call came back is Kim Il-sung had accepted it, and that crisis was over. So we know the troops did not go over there. None of the plans, all the plans we had in preparation were put in the ash can. And a few months later, we negotiated something called the Agreed Framework, by which the North Koreans agreed to stop that activity. Well, with the North Koreans, nothing is ever simple, nothing is ever over. And so 5 years later, we had another crisis. This time, I was out of office, but President Clinton called me up and asked me if I would go over and serve as his envoy. I said, well, not by myself. This issue affects South Korea and Japan just at least as much as it affects us. So I would like to have a representative from each of those countries work with me. So we formed what's called a tripartite group, US, Japan, South Korea. In addition to that, I met with the Chinese and the Russians to get their views on it. And finally, I went over to Pyongyang to present the proposal to stop what they were doing then. That was a very successful meeting, and it resulted in the then leader, Kim Jong-il, sending his top general to Washington to meet with Madeleine Albright, President Clinton, and myself. And we were that close to signing the final agreement on this when a funny thing happened, which is an election in the United States, and a new president came in. So before we could sign that agreement, President Bush had taken office. I was not concerned because I'd had deep discussions with Colin Powell, who was about to become his Secretary of State. And Colin assured me, we like this plan, we'll follow through with the plan, we'll get it signed and finished. And that would have happened, I believe. But just 2 months after President Bush was elected, the then President of South Korea, Kim Dae-jung, came over to visit President Bush to get his assurance they would follow through on this program with North Korea, take the danger away from them. And as luck would have it, when President Kim Dae-jung arrived, the meeting the first day was not with the president, it was with Colin Powell. And Colin Powell assured him that, yes, we're going to go ahead with this, we're going to sign this final agreement, the issue is resolved. Unfortunately, they had that press conference and reported that. And so the Washington Post the next morning had big headlines that Bush agrees to Clinton program. That was all it took. The next day when President Kim Il-sung met with President Bush, the answer was no, we're cutting off all dialogue with North Korea, it's all over. And the rest is history. Now the North Koreans have had 4 tests of nuclear weapons. They've built, we don't know how many, a dozen or 2. They're threatening South Korea, they're threatening Japan, they're threatening the United States, for God's sakes. Not that they can deliver on that threat, but it's a very dangerous situation.
Kim Dae-jung was the Nobel Peace Prize winner for the work that he did in South Korea.
Yes.
I know that he had 17 attempts on his life, that he had really helped bring democracy to South Korea, and that he continued with the Sunshine Policy, despite that, trying to build bridges with the North Koreans. I was there with him in 2006 in Gwangju, in his center, with the Nobel Peace Laureates. There was a summit of Nobel Peace Prize winners, and I was there to help draft a statement. No, I'm sorry, I was there representing the International Peace Bureau,
yeah,
a Nobel laureate organization. And there was a delegation from North Korea at this conference,
yeah,
a large delegation. And what really surprised me was the delegation of the labor unions from South Korea talking about what they'd learned from studying the unification of East and West Germany and how that affected the labor unions of West Germany, which were obviously affected when you had these drastically different economies integrating. So they were getting very, very practical and realistic And right around that time, one of our naval fleets was doing exercises off the coast of North Korea, and they completely freaked out.
Yeah.
And so that fell apart. But what I saw from that, because I'd never actually seen North Koreans before, was something that you keep bringing up in this great book, which is that they are human beings, they can be talked to, they can recognize common interests, and things can change. But when this partisanship jumps in, and here it was our own domestic partisanship and foolery that
Let me give you two incidents from my visit to Pyongyang, which I think were very revealing in that sense. One of them, we took over with us a huge case of medical supplies. And the first night when I met with the president of North Korea to discuss the agenda, I asked, could I deliver these medical supplies to the Children's Hospital tomorrow? He said, of course, we'll arrange for that. And we did that. And when I went into the hospital, the woman who was in charge of the hospital very graciously received us and was very grateful. She was almost tears in her eyes because they had no antibiotics. She said, children are dying here every day because we don't have antibiotics. We're so grateful for delivering. When we were done, she said, would you like to come in and meet some of the children? I said, of course I would. She said, I have to warn you, I told them you were coming. The American Secretary of Defense was coming. And they said, is he here to kill us? Is he here to kill us? The effects of corrosive propaganda day in and day out, that was the kind of background we had. Of course, when I went in, we had a lovely session. It was very nice. But the other thing that happened at that first night meeting with the president, I told him, I'm not satisfied with the agenda. It does not have any military. I was the Secretary of Defense. I want to meet with some of your senior military people. So sure enough, the next morning, when I walked into the meeting room, there was a general sitting there, a North Korean general. He stood up and introduced himself. He said, I'm General so-and-so. He said, this meeting is not my idea. I was directed to come here by the president. So I said, well, why don't you want to talk with me? He said, I don't think we should be even discussing giving up nuclear weapons. So I got the Army's point of view pretty clearly and directly from this man. I said, well, why not? Why do you think you need nuclear weapons? Mm-hmm. He looked at me in amazement. He said, of course, to defend ourselves. I said, from whom? And he pointed to me, from America. And then this was at the time when NATO was bombing
Kosovo.
Belgrade. He said, you send American bombers into North Korea, you will end up with a nuclear bomb being detonated in your cities, not excluding Palo Alto, my hometown, of course. So he'd done his homework. He knew I came from Palo Alto. Well, that meeting got off to kind of a rough start. But it went on to be a very productive meeting, actually. It was very interesting to hear his point of view and understand how strongly he felt that as a military man, he understood that American conventional forces were far superior to North Korean. Even though the smaller in number, they were far superior, and that he needed the nuclear weapons to protect himself. My job was to pretend we don't plan to use it. We don't plan to attack you. It's not in our interest at all to do that. So we had actually ended up having a very good discussion. That was a very instructive visit to Pyongyang, I think.
One of the highlights that you're known for is working with the Gang of Four. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Secretary Perry have been advancing with Wall Street Journal articles, which I commend to everyone's attention, that nuclear weapons have become a real threat to our security, and they lay out certain steps that are needed to get us to a nuclear weapons-free world, but that the vision of a world without nuclear weapons is required to move there. And part of the steps that they have been advocating is something that our section should be very proud of, strongly supporting, which is ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And thanks largely to Michael Biowitz's advocacy in the House of Delegates, there is a resolution of the American Bar Association that the American Bar Association urges the United States to ratify the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And in the brief that accompanies it, we argue as lawyers that the test ban is a way of promoting international security using the rule of law, and that nobody wants any further testing of nuclear weapons, but to do it in an ad hoc fashion through a moratorium is inadequate compared to the positive law that a treaty provides, and that America should take a leadership. But I wondered if you could just walk through the realpolitik security reasons why we need to ban nuclear testing.
I was Secretary of Defense when we signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And my job was to bring the military and the lab chiefs, nuclear lab chiefs, in agreement with that. Because if they didn't have that, we'd never get it ratified in Congress. And we did that, and it was a very successful set of meetings. One of the consequences of that, by the way, was a new program called the Stockpile Stewardship Program, by which the laboratories were authorized to take the technical steps necessary that they could validate the effectiveness of their nuclear weapons without testing, do it by computer simulation and very scientific and technical means. That program, by the way, goes on to this day, and it's been a very successful program. So in 1996, almost my last month as secretary, we got all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, all the heads of the services, and the nuclear lab directors all agreeing the test ban treaty would be a good thing. And we got President, and with that basis, President Clinton was happy to sign it. I then left office, and about a year later, they put it up to the Senate for ratification, and the Senate declined the ratification. And each president since then has started bringing it up again, but each time they've been discouraged from doing that because they're advised by their legislative leaders that it would not be passed. Simply speaking, I believe then and I believe today that quite aside from the international reason that you advance the comprehensive test ban, it is in the interest of Americans' national security. Now, putting on my hat, I don't have to put on my hat as a peace lover. I put on my hat as the Secretary of Defense only. In terms of U.S. national security interests, the comprehensive test ban treaty advances those interests. So I've never been able to reconcile myself to talk sensibly to the people who are opposing, because I cannot understand where they're coming from. But
it seems largely theological rather than rational, since we don't need to test and others could test and thus put us at peril.
We have tested more than 1,000 times, many more than any other country has tested. We have better scientific capability through the Stockpile Stewardship Program and others thing. So it's all in our interest to see no other countries test. The worst that can happen at this stage is testing begins again. Pakistan and India go ahead to develop and test hydrogen bombs. Other countries begin to test. China begins to test. Russia tests again. All of those things are detrimental to America's security interest. And so the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is one of the best features we ever had for advancing America's security interests. And yet it's being opposed and not being ratified. It's been, 20 years now since it was signed.
But the moratorium is held for the most part, except...
Yes.
From a lawyer's point of view, the whole nuclear venture violates, a body of law called international humanitarian law, which prohibits the use of weapons of indiscriminate effect. Part of the reason why we have the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, weapons that cause unnecessary suffering beyond any specific military objective, weapons that create irreversible environmental hazard. And the World Court, when it addressed the issue, was given some hypotheticals, such as a depth charge in the high seas, which wouldn't violate those principles, or a nuclear bomb in the Gobi Desert against a military deployment, which wouldn't violate those principles either. So the court said that in all instances, it could not rule out the use of a nuclear weapon. as being violating international humanitarian law. But those are the exceptions. I mean, those are not the way in which we really use nuclear weapons. And so I think there's a real need for our section to start addressing the international humanitarian law aspects of it. There are countries, as we're speaking now, meeting in Geneva, an open-ended working group in the United Nations system addressing the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So we've been silent on that, and I think I'm going to be bringing that to the section in the way we dealt with the test ban treaty, because there's obviously, from listening to Secretary Perry, the hazard has not gotten any better. The situation has only become more dire in many ways, and I think that we have to be the grown-ups. We're not really seeing a grown-up debate in the presidential election presently, and I think it's for us to step up if we can. One of the things that we're both involved in is this group with the United Religions Initiative, which is not just calling on realpolitik or law, but on calling on something even above us. And the interesting composition of this group is yourself, Secretary Schultz, Sidney Drell, who I think used to run a lab.
Well, he was the deputy director of the Stanford Linear Accelerator.
Yeah. Right, so yeah. the Lawrence Livermore Lab, he was helped make the bombs, and Ambassadors James Goodby and Ambassador Thomas Graham. Mm-hmm. And we recently did a YouTube that's going to be a high production, that is a prayer that, that Bishop Swing created. And I wondered if we could end maybe reading some of Bishop Swing's prayer.
All right.
Would you like that?
Read it.
I'll read part of it. You read the okay. Last part, okay? Right. So this is a prayer that we've done on YouTube, and you'll see it with George Schultz doing part of it, and Sidney Drell doing part of it, and myself. The beginning, but I'm sharing it with us because it's a prayer about responsibility. I've shared responsibility. The beginning and the end are in your hands, O Creator of the universe, and in our hands you have placed the fate of this planet. We who are tested by having both creative and destructive power in our free will turn to you in sober fear and intoxicating hope. We ask for your guidance and to share in your imagination in our deliberations about the use of nuclear force. Help us to lift the fog of atomic darkness that hovers so pervasively over our earth, your earth, so that soon all eyes may see life magnified by your pure light.
Bless all of us who wait today for your presence and who dedicate ourselves to achieve your intended peace and rightful equilibrium on earth, in the name of all that is holy and all that is hoped. Amen.
Well, the tools that we have is reason, advocacy, law, and passion. And we are the international law section of the ABA, American Bar Association. I think we have a responsibility to respond to this call. As one of my heroes, Secretary William Perry, has responded. Thank you so much, sir.